everyone, my name is Julia Mayetta. We are so pleased that you all could join us for our last lecture in Volume 3 of our 12-week No Neuropsychology Didactic Series that brings you lectures from experts in the field covering different topics each week. This series was created by trainees and early career neuropsychologists to provide free, high-quality didactic opportunities, and we would like to thank our sponsors for their financial support of the series. Before we start, here are the disclaimers. This training is not meant to replace formal education in neuropsychology, and the views of the speakers are their own. Questions can be submitted via the Q&A box on the lower left or middle of your screen, and the recording of today's lecture will be provided on our website later this week. Now, since today is our last lecture in Volume 3, we are really excited to announce our upcoming series. So starting on July 12th, we're premiering our first 7-week mini-series called No Neuroanatomy, which will cover in-depth topics related to clinical neuroanatomy. We then kick off Volume 4 of our 12-week No Neuropsychology Didactic Series on September 13th with Dr. Jennifer Manley. So keep an eye out on your emails for Volume 3's post-series survey. This really helps us plan for future lecture topics and logistics for the upcoming series. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. William Barr for today's lecture called Can We Come to a Consensus on Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy, or CTE? Dr. Barr is the director of the Neuropsychology Division in the Department of Neurology at NYU Langone Health and an associate professor of neurology at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine. He has spent his career performing clinical and research studies on epilepsy, concussion, and neurodegenerative disorders. He has been a professional consultant to professional sports leagues, including the National Hockey League and the National Football League. And he has been performing research studies on concussion in athletes since the 1990s. He is also an active participant in current studies on CTE, which is the focus of today's lecture. So we are certainly very pleased that Dr. Barr could join us, and I will turn it over to him.
Great. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today. I think the board of neuropsychology, I think you guys have been doing a great job, and keep up the good work, and happy to participate in this. All right, so as I mentioned, I'm going to talk a bit about chronic traumatic encephalopathy today. In terms of disclosures, you heard some of my things about past contact with the leagues and that, and a current investigator on one of the studies, but also that I do serve as an expert witness in some court cases in relation to concussion and CTE. All right, so having been around a long time, it has its advantages. I've really been able to pretty much directly witness the modern era of sports concussion in the study of CTE from its beginning. Early on in sports concussion, of course, neuropsychology and other scientists were interested in the study of boxers, as you might imagine, by the inherent risks in boxing. It was in the 1990s that our interest in the modern era started with a couple of high profile of concussions in NFL players, particularly Merrill Hodge and Al Toon of the New York Jets, of which I was able to do some consulting on that case. And then at the same time, there was some similar high-profile athletes in the NHL. Pat LaFontaine, Eric Lindros had concussions, and it really became a hot topic. And the questions became that what are we going to do about the kids, about youth sports? What's going to happen there? In terms of concussions in the NFL, it turned into its own story. When it started with a gentleman that I worked with on the New York Jets, Elliot Pellman, who was a rheumatologist who was named as the head of the NFL's MTBI committee, and some controversies arose about his as running the committee, the research that was being produced by the committee, and so on. Shortly after that, there were the first cases of CTE were described. And then following that, there was questions about the NFL and its safety, and there were congressional hearings that NFL, the commissioner, Roger Goodell, appeared there, and other things. This was followed by an excellent book on the whole controversy with the NFL, and called League of Denial. And there was an accompanying documentary performed by PBS at the same time. And of course, it all came to a real height with the production of the movie of Concussion, based on the story of Benedict Omalu, the pathologist who discovered CTE in the football player, and that came to the forefront. So there's been a lot of stuff that have happened over time. In terms of the story of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, we're all probably familiar, especially if you saw the movie, that the first signature case was Mike Webster, who was a famous center for the Pittsburgh Steelers, who had run a number of Super Bowls, and he had passed away at the age of 50 after showing some unusual behavior, some changes in behaviors after that. He came to postmortem, and he was examined by Benedict Omalu, a Nigerian neuropathologist, who discovered that Webster had signs of some of the neuropathologic changes that had only up to that point been described in boxers. So that he diagnosed him as having chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and then some cases followed, as seen here, as the reporting in the New York Times by Alan Schwartz. A number of cases appeared, and then the story moved over a bit to Boston, where a group at Boston University described a series of cases, looked at some similarities in these cases, and presented data showing basically the whole idea of, here's a normal brain, here's a brain on football, pretty compelling to the eye, and then reporting a series of cases where 110 out of 100 NFL brains of NFL players were found to be diagnosed with chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And there we go with a lot of controversy in science and other things. So stepping back a little bit, as we know, chronic traumatic encephalopathy is a condition that's been identified for a number of years. It started the first modern age, or at least a 20th century description, was Martlin's 1928 study. It's been given various names over the years: punch drunk syndrome, dementia pugilistica. It's been thought to be observed in a certain proportion of retired boxers, and have progression observed in 30% or so, preceded by a soft period. And there's a constellation of symptoms that include basic neurologic symptoms, headache, cognitive changes, and disinhibition. And so these have been well described over the years. But it's really in modern time, it's the Boston group that has whose work has become most prominent, most cited as defining chronic traumatic encephalopathy as a progressive tauopathy that occurs as a consequence of repetitive mild traumatic brain injury. The important thing there, and that distinguishes this story from the concussion story, is that this is a result of cumulative exposure. You don't necessarily have to have discrete concussions to develop this syndrome. So it's the repetitive brain injury causes a specific pattern of tauopathy. That tauopathy causes a clinical profile of symptoms that's distinct from other clinical neurodegenerative conditions, which is an interesting area interesting point to discuss. So it really comes down to repetitive brain injury causes tau pathology, causes clinical symptoms of CTE, or the basic premises of the CTE model. It's been extended somewhat that their group in Boston, again with leading by Anne McKee, neuropathologist, that there are stages whole spectrum of disease in CTE. There are stages from 1 to 4 that are characterized by gradations in clinical symptoms, starting with like mild memory and depressive symptoms, going through increasing behavioral outbursts and cognitive deficits, and advancing through what we would all recognize clearly as a form of dementia. And that these clinical stages are, it's hypothesized that they're accompanied by similar stages in the progression of the neuropathology, that is the tauopathy, by where it's deposed, how much of it is deposited there, and other things. So that is another piece of the puzzle there. So, this is, well recognized, and people have been talking about it. But there is another side of the coin that I want to talk about today. And this is, part of what, I want to emphasize in this talk today is that there's a lot of controversy associated with CTE. And I want to examine what is that all about. So this first part of the talk, I just went through the intro and set up the story with what is CTE, what are people saying, and now talk a little bit about the flip side. And what I'm going to get into later on is some work I've been doing is looking at the social media constructs and the whole idea of how you've got people who believe CTE exists and all the football players are going to get it. And then the idea that there are people who don't believe that necessarily, and they're labeled as something else. And that's, I want to look into the social psychology of what that all about. So this is a paper that came out in 2019 in Nature Reviews in Neurology by some prominent neuropathology experts, and talking about, there's a lot of media stuff going on, but there's also a lot of confusion to the public because it's been presented by the media that this is a done deal, that that football causes CTE, and that there's a mechanism in all of this. And the whole point I want to make, and the point they make in this paper, is that, we're still in the infancy of the science for this. And to make all these assumptions that all of these things that are hypothesized are actually true is really premature. And that we're doing, well, we've clearly done a service to the public in terms of highlighting that there are some dangers associated with some of these sports, that you do need to manage concussions in a safe manner. And there's a lot of things that need to be changed the way they used to do things in the past, but we don't know as much as we think we do. Let's put it that way. And in this paper, they show the progression of things, just like I outlined for you, going from the boxing studies and going through the time course where the proliferation of more and more papers on CTE over time. And what these guys are, these points that they're making is that there's a long way to go to even understand the basic neuropathologic processes involved with the tau and other neuropathologic features, and what necessarily makes repetitive TBI different than what happens after a single moderate or severe TBI. That a lot is not known about these, and there's a lot of possible neuropathologic and other physiologic results that can happen from these injuries, and we still don't know a lot about it. In our own, and so when you look at the reaction of some of the major organizations, so this is the findings from an international collaboration on MTBI, the conclusion about CTE that was drawn in their 2014 paper was that the literature is dominated by uncontrolled case reports and case series, which raise interesting hypotheses, but cannot infer causality. Looking at another group, the Concussion and Sport group that convenes every several years in Europe, it's an international group. Their conclusion in their most recent paper on this was in 2017 that a cause and effect relationship has not been demonstrated between CTE and sports-related concussions or exposure to contact sports. As such, the notion that repeated concussion or subconcussive impacts cause CTE remains unknown. And what they're calling for is more controlled research on the incidence and prevalence and the extent to which neuropathologic findings cause the symptoms and other features. So there's a, when you talk to the professional organizations, there's a lot of less confidence on what all this is, and clearly stating the need for more information. Our own field, the Sports Neuropsych Society, has this statement out that says, basically doesn't come out as strong as some of these other organizations, saying that we still need to know more, but they're communicating CTE is real, but we're still learning about it, and still telling people you can still play sports because it doesn't mean you're going to develop CTE. So a nice balanced view there. So when we look at some of our some of the papers that have come out in our field, we have some very outspoken critics of CTE, starting with my friend and colleague Chris Randolph, who's published a couple papers on this, where in the first paper he asked the question, is chronic traumatic encephalopathy a real disease? And then in the second paper, published 4 years later, he concludes it is not a real disease. And good for him. But the point he makes is that there's a lot of, at least in that first paper, the criteria for the neuropathology and the clinical features for CTE were evolving over time, that there was really no information on the incidence of this condition, unknown significance of the tau deposition, and that the argument that the cognitive changes that are seen in some football players are indistinguishable from cognitive changes that would be associated with other conditions such as MCI. And the argument is made that things like the mortality and suicide rates are actually lower in NFL players than in age-matched controls. So all this thing about football being bad for you and killing you is not supported by all the data. Later on, he again makes, in that second paper, makes arguments that there's no evidence of increased CNS disease in retired players, and in those with the clinical symptoms, it could really be explained by other conditions like MCI and that. Another person is Grant Iverson. He's had a number of papers looking at these features. When one of his papers opens is CTE has been recognized but not well studied for more than 80 years. So he again talks about no agreed upon criteria for diagnosis, the question of whether CTE is progressive or pathologic. And he goes through and does a number of interesting studies where he shows that CTE pathology that is seen in individuals with a known contact sports history it can be seen. And there are some cases where there's no CTE pathology in those with high exposure. And so that is, clearly not a one-to-one correspondence. There are exceptions to the rule on both ends. We can also look at some other reviews by some of the younger folks in our field, including these nice reviews by Askin and Brett. In the Askin one, that there's talk about some of the complexities of are there individual differences in susceptibility to the repetitive brain injuries? How about issues like cognitive reserve? All these things that need to be paid attention to. And the study by Brett is a review of various criteria for various neurodegenerative diseases. And basically what he goes through is when did the study of this condition start? What are the pathologic criteria, the clinical criteria? What's the sensitivity and specificity of the neuropathologic criteria? And argument is much of this is clearly lacking in the study of CTE. In a nice review by Schaffert et al. The neuropsych studies, that review of 22 studies using neuropsychological methodology in NFL players, with the conclusions are this, there is some suggestion of a higher prevalence of cognitive impairment in the NFL retirees, and with some evidence that there's some verbal memory impairment. But there's no establishment of any quantifiable risk of these conditions, including CTE. The clinical significance is unclear due to small sample sizes and other features, and clearly from the absence of any longitudinal data. And the findings on the dose response between the cognitive decline and the head injury exposure have been mixed. So in coming from a neuropsychological perspective, what many of our colleagues have been talking about is that Perhaps there is, if you think about the clinical threshold model for development of dementia or cognitive changes with age, that's something like we know the hypothesis is that concussion or brain injury could cause some changes in that threshold by affecting cognitive reserve to some extent. And that there's still a possible mechanism that something like repetitive injury could lead to that. But the question is, what does it result in the end? Does it result in a whole new different neurodegenerative condition like CTE, or do people are more prone to get something like Alzheimer's earlier than they would have got it if they didn't play the sport? And that becomes a major issue. And some of the existing data are supporting that model, that maybe these football players are just getting MCI and other conditions earlier than other individuals because of playing these sports. Here's a study that Randolph and colleagues performed using R-bands data in retired NFL players and compared them to MCI profiles, and found pretty much the same kind of profile, suggesting that if you are seeing cognitive changes in these NFL players, maybe they're just getting MCI, and maybe it's not this this new condition of CTE. The UT Southwestern group has done a number of excellent studies on a cohort they've been studying, focusing on things like depressive symptoms, white matter changes, cognitive impairment, and again, considering it the condition more like MCI. And assuming that, okay, if there are cognitive changes in these NFL players, what does it look like? Is it something new like CTE? And at the bottom there's a very interesting paper by Lou Gehrig and his colleagues there that looked at a data set of neuropathologic and neuropsych data from the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center, and found that a certain percentage, a small percent, had diagnoses of CTE there, and looked at the profiles of those CTE cases. And first showed that there was not clear that these were all football players or anything like that, but importantly that the neuropsych profile seen in that group was very similar to what was seen in the Alzheimer's group, and the percentage of the mood and behavior symptoms in that group was not that significantly different, with the findings suggesting that if you pull them out based on the neuropathologic characteristics, they look clinically like Alzheimer's. All right, so in terms of CT, what we do and don't know is that there's a lot with a lot to be learned about the epidemiology, the specificity of the pathology and clinical symptoms. That's a real big area. Is that one of the things that are clear, that there's a lot of overlap between some of the symptoms that have been attributed to CTE with known conditions like Alzheimer's or depression or other things. Questions about the neuropath mechanisms, the exposure to subconcussive blows, and the explanation of complex behaviors by the tauopathy being things like, can you really explain something like suicide or aggressive behavior solely on the basis of having tau there? So, there are a lot of things to be answered about it, but what I'm going to focus on today is some of the issues with the diagnosis and the specificity of the pathologic mechanisms. So, as we know that CTE is a neuropathologic diagnosis, that's how it's been established. But over the last number of years, we've clearly had individuals come out to the public or studies that have come out where people have been said that they're diagnosed with CTE. The issue is that we haven't had criteria for diagnosing CTE until just recently. And how could people have done this? And what are the professionals doing diagnosing people with conditions of which there are no known diagnostic criteria? And that's been an issue. And in fact, this is an interesting study that came out of Harvard, showing that in their nearly 4,000 athletes that they studied, about nearly 3% had reported already being diagnosed with CTE. So what they did was they compared that group to the other folks that hadn't been diagnosed, and showed that there was a relatively higher rate of known medical conditions in that CTE group, like sleep apnea, depression, the treatment for pain and other things that are potentially treatable other conditions, that there's a lot of comorbidities in these cases, suggesting that it's not just a primary neurodegenerative condition, but we need to take into account the effects of these comorbidities. So in response to all the issues, of course, the Boston University group has been very prolific and done a huge number of studies and really taken this thing full on. And with their criteria that they've developed over the years, there's been a couple of main studies of which they've developed diagnostic criteria. So the first one is a UNITE study that's run by Anne McKee and colleagues. That is, among the goals are to focus on the neuropathology and establishing criteria, consensus criteria for pathology and other things that have a nationwide brain donation program and such. So they've had 2 papers out now that are looking at consensus criteria, convening panels of NINDS and other groups, consensus meetings to define the neuropathologic criteria. In the first study, they had 10 cases that they looked at compared to 15 other cases, and they showed some very good agreement among the neuropathologists who reviewed these cases with the Cohen's cap of 0.67. They've had a second paper come out just a couple months ago, showing again strong agreement in the diagnosis of CTE with both blinded and clinical gross neuropathic information. However, the results of that study showed that that staging system, talking about that 1 to 4, was actually not found to be consistent. But in the second paper, at least there's some clear pathologic criteria that have been outlined and a flow chart to go and to guide clinicians and researchers, I should say. I'll get back to that point. The researchers in making the neuropathologic diagnosis of CTE. So one step I want to take back is that, I was always told that neuropathology is the final answer. When I was training many years ago, that was clearly the goal. But when you think of it, and this is one thing I want to convey to the younger folks, is that neuropathology is a methodology and a science just like any others. And in neuropsychology, we often worry about our validity, our reliability, our retest reliability, and all this kind of stuff. And we assume that the medical guys got it down, and that we don't have to ask those questions. But when you think about it, if you ask medical professionals, what's the retest reliability of white blood cell count? They have no clue. Or what kind of sample was the white blood cell count norms? What kind of sample is that drawn for? Who's in that sample? How many people? They can't tell you that. So in our field, at least we pay attention to this kind of stuff. And what I'm getting at is that when you think about neuropathology, it's not as accurate or much of a consensus as you think. And then when you look at some of the studies on these cases, that the sensitivity for something like an Alzheimer's diagnosis ranges from 0.76 to 93, and specificity 0.55 to 0.91, with a general accuracy in the 90% range. So you think that neuropathology is the ultimate word. Well, even in the clear conditions like Alzheimer's, it's not accurate. So when you think about some of the issues with what's going on in neuropathology of CTE, you got to take into account that that's a science, and there are different ways to view the methodology and other things. So there are people out there, notably a neuropathologist named Rudy Castellani, who's had a number of papers talking about, so maybe they've put the cart before the horse there, and pointing out for some of the neuropathologic features where there's some issues with these things. And talking about the association between concussion and p-tau is unclear. The issue is tau a toxic thing, or is it inert? Is it reflecting a neuropathologic process, or is it just reflecting the effects of normal aging and other things? And features like, is the regional deposition of tau so important, and is that a better correlate than the proteinopathy? So there's all sorts of issues. A lot of the stuff he writes are way over my head, because I don't know, I'm not a neuropathologist, but the point is there is another argument out there. All right, so turning to the clinical syndrome, offered, the features offered in the clinical syndrome is what we call traumatic encephalopathy syndrome. And a number of years ago, the folks in Boston put together some preliminary proposed criteria to define that, to get some research started. And these features have included things like behavioral features, the mood kind of features, including other things like explosivity, loss of control, short fuse, general mood features, depression, suicidal thoughts, other things, cognitive features, of course, dementia, memory impairment, executive dysfunction, and motor features. And they put together criteria that included things like exposure to the repetitive brain injury, having the core clinical features, and other things. So these were preliminary criteria that were used, and a number of studies showed that they were, pretty much overly broad. That in one study by Iverson, just looking at data from a national survey, found that between 7 and 12% of, depending on the definition applied, of people in the general population met criteria for TES. A study performed by the Southwestern Group, Shafford study, shows that if you apply the criteria to NFL players, a high frequency, about 56% is seen. So that you see a high rate of these kinds of symptoms in general population, and of course in NFL players. So with that, Bob Stern got funding for an exciting project, and I'm proud to be a member of this project. This is a multi-center study that comes out of Boston University. NYU, our center, is part of it. The Mayo Clinic in Arizona, and the UNLV are all a part of the studies. So it's all these different sites. And so what the goals are is to study 3 groups, really: a high exposure NFL player group, a medium exposure of college players, and a control group. And these folks come in to these various centers, these various sites. And this, we were lucky to get most of the baseline collected before COVID, get all the clinical exams, meaning neuropsych testing and a whole bunch of scans and bloods and all that kind of stuff acquired at that point. And then the goal is to do some follow-up. But during that, as part of the study, was to hold one of these NINDS consensus meetings for establishing the clinical diagnosis of TES. And to do that, held a big meeting out in Arizona, invited people from the study and other experts who were outside of the study, many of which were, like me, kind of skeptics about CTE. With this group, they've developed they use what is called the Delphi method, way of coming up with consensus, criteria based on a large number of people and specific questions. And these criteria were developed and published recently in neurology. And so what they include are, again, a more specific definition of the exposure to the repetitive head impacts. The core clinical features are now cognitive impairment, defined as either memory impairment or executive dysfunction, with plus or instead neurobehavioral dysregulation and a progressive course, not accounted for by other conditions, and that all sorts of other features, but well defined and criteria to meet the needs of research in coming years. So of course that there are some issues with it, and Monroe Cullum and Christian Lobu had a quick follow-up publication of a study pointing out some of the limitations, including things like the definition of the substantial repetitive head trauma, big criteria of neurobehavioral dysregulation, that the notion of CTE is a progressive disorder is proven, and the challenge, how do you actually show that the condition's not accounted for by other things? And these are all valid criticism and all things that are going to need to be addressed. But the issue is, their take-home points, we now have diagnostic criteria to use in neuropathologic and clinical studies. It's emphasized in these papers that these are preliminary research criteria and are not to be used for clinical or forensic purposes. This is for research, okay? And my feeling is it's our responsibility as scientists, even whether our hypotheses are that this stuff is supported or not, to use these criteria to address major questions through the empirical studies. So that's the part of the consensus part. So we now have consensus criteria to diagnose, at least define what we're looking at. Now all the issues about doing the epidemiology, doing the relationship to the various criteria, that the starting point is there now. And as you know, someone who's been considered skeptic over the years, you got to start somewhere. You can't just say that it doesn't exist and not study it. The horse is out of the barn, and we gotta we gotta address what this issue is. The last part of this talk is talking about what the horse is and coming out of the barn and stuff. So this is going to address the CTE media frenzy, which I've alluded to, but really try to get a closer look at what is all of this about, and how does this relate to other things in our current day and age, and social media and other things. But you know, we all are familiar with the headlines. I watch a lot of sports. I don't know how many games I've watched where they've talked about the issues with the concussions and the head trauma and other things. And you know, it's been all over the place. What's been interesting is to see how it's been over applied. So there's been questions about things like, did Lou Gehrig have Lou Gehrig disease? Since he not only played baseball, but he played football when he was a college player at Columbia, maybe he had CTE instead of ALS. Goes further than that. There's been questions since OJ was accused of having aggressive behaviors, that maybe he suffers from having. And in fact, Bennett Omalu, the Nigerian pathologist, that made that statement that he likely suffers from that. And who pipes in but none other but Cuba Gooding Jr. thinks so too. And that's a headline. Some people think that Ernest Hemingway, who committed suicide, might have had the same brain disease, battering the NFL, and that the multiple concussions he had from his sports activities, boxing and other things, led to that. But my favorite one, and the biggest jump in my mind, is maybe Elvis had CTE too. There's people have talked about Elvis having head trauma and other things, and shows about the head trauma, and maybe he had some issues that were related to it. So as you see, that this has really gone far. But so what are some of the things behind it? So part of it is people love controversy and cover-ups. So when that first study, Bennett Omalu describing Mike Webster, the NFL's response was, well, wait a minute. And so with that comes, who I've mentioned before, Elliot Pellman, the rheumatologist who was head of the MTBI committee, and Ira Caston, who was a neurologist who had actually done some previous studies on boxing and neuropsychological impairment, neurologic impairment, and they disagreed in that. In fact, they were calling for a retraction of that paper because of it. Well, that caught a lot of attention to say, so why is the NFL so defensive about this? What's going on with them? And in fact, you know, there's a whole issue about whether the league admitted to the fact that some of these players are developing some of these conditions. There's been big differences in two of the major sports leagues. After years and years of discussion and controversy, Roger Goodell and the NFL, the hierarchy admitted that there's some kind of link between football and CTE. Whereas in the NHL, the Commissioner Gary Bettman has continued to deny the CTE link, and there's been a whole different story with that group. With the leagues acting that way, people have said this is just like tobacco and lung cancer. And those of you who are too young to know about this was a big stuff in the paper all the time. When I was younger, that at the time they started discovering that tobacco causes lung cancer, that the tobacco industry was accused of starting research to show that that wasn't true and to downgrade existing studies. And they were finally exposed and had to admit and there was a huge lawsuits and everything like that. Well, there's been this is not going out of the eyes of the media. In fact, Alan Schwartz showed that there was actually some links between the NFL's concussion research and their ties to the same kind of law firms that were involved in the tobacco cases. So, ongoing controversies there. The New York Times also has had some other controversial papers. So this is a study of a hockey player who was an enforcer, the one who got in a lot of fights and other things, and then passed away. And then when his brain came to post-mortem analysis, a well-known, a well-regarded neuropathologist in Canada had stated that there were no pathologic signs of CTE. Then the brain was sent to Boston, where there were found, where neuropathologic signs were found. Now, as scientists, we see this as even if purely science, or even in the medical legal realm, that we've got two professionals who have conflicting findings, and what you try to do is get to the source of that. Well, as you see from the headlines, the New York Times concluded that he did have it, but clearly siding with the second diagnosis. And this article has a whole bunch of things about that. The interesting response, though, is that a number of neuropathologists got together and because of that article and state this and wrote in the Lancet a brief editorial that's saying, contrary to common perception, the clinical syndrome of CTE has not yet been fully defined. Its prevalence is unknown, and the neuropathologic diagnostic criteria no more than preliminary. And it's signed by a number of distinguished members of our field and other fields, including neuropathology and neurology. So that, and the point I like to make with that is that this thing got no press, that there were no press releases about this or anything else about that. So there have been a number of issues with CTE and public policies. There's been rule changes that have been helpful, enactment of laws, of course, lawsuits, issues with people calling to ban youth tackle football, and other things that have come out in the, and I'm going to fly through this in the interest of time, but on some of these points, but I think you're familiar with some of these things that have happened across the country. Some of the things I found kind of interesting is that because of the fear of causing CTE in young folks, which is not established at all, people have been marketing products to the public, things like headbands to stop concussion, mouth guards that could turn green when a concussion supposedly occurs. As you might know, as you might guess, that these things are not very well proven in terms of the science. And in fact, when you think about some of the things that have been around a lot that we've used in our own field, that when you study things like impact, it really only has, according to the CARE Consortium study, 56% sensitivity and 62% specificity in diagnosing concussion. So this, a lot of this has gotten ahead of the science. As I said, there's been some litigation, class actions, lawsuits, and other things. What I want to turn to is where the public beliefs on all this. So this is a small study looking at Amazon MTurk, but what they're asking is that questions about CTE, and in this survey that's published by MERS et al., that 89% of people say that repeated concussions from playing contact sports cause CTE. That's 89% of people out there believe this. CTE can be diagnosed before death, 54%. This is way in advance of those consensus criteria coming out. 62% CTE could be caused by a single event. Where are they getting this information? Other surveys show that a lot of it they're getting from the news media, the sports media, and other things. It's coming from the media, not from the science. And of course, we can't expect folks to be reading New England Journal, but they're getting all this information, and this information is going out there unfiltered and making conclusions. As a result, people have been having concerns about decreased participation in things like youth football. You see the numbers of declines. There's been bills introduced in various states about restrictions or maybe even banning tackle football for kids at a certain age based on conflicting they're clearly conflicting findings that when looking at the science, but focusing on one side of the coin. And in my concluding slides, I just want to talk about a little bit, how does all this happen? How do these things occur? So as someone who you might know me from some of my Twitter posts and that, I've been doing it a number of years. My idea with this at the beginning, what came out of this was that I just wanted to put the science out there, that in my thought that what was coming out to the public was just one side of everything. I wanted to give both sides, and not just the contrary side. I wanted to give both sides. And so that's some of my goals in tweeting regarding concussion and other things. So what has happened on Twitter, and this is where I first noticed this stuff, is that if you raise questions about the science, people call you a denier. And they say it's like a climate change denier, or Bettman, the NHL commissioner, is a denier. Willie Stewart, a prominent neuropathologist there on the right, he sums it up perfectly, that you either believe it's a fully divine disease, or if not, you're a denier. And I've had NFL players done, veiled threats about some of my views on Twitter because of this stuff. So it's either that you buy in, or if you question the science, you're labeled a denier. So I had an opportunity to give up an address at the Canadian Psychological Association a couple of years ago. I wrote the paper about believers versus deniers that's published in the Canadian in Canadian Psychology, the journal. And in that, I go over some of the social psychology factors that are responsible for this, which are really quite fascinating. Starting with things that are in your social psychology textbooks, and things that if you're not licensed already, you got to study the stuff and still know it. And I recommend you continue to know it, because it can help you later on in your life. So starting with things like attribution theory and other stuff. But one of the more fascinating features is this concept of the availability cascade, which has been used to talk about things over the years, like vaccines and other things. How do you start these stories, and what happens with them? And really what it is that a self-sustaining chain of events comes from a relatively minor event and then leads to public panic and large-scale government action. In some cases, the story catches the attention of a segment of the public, and they become concerned about it. This story becomes the story itself, prompting additional coverage in the media, which in turn produces greater concern and involvement. The cycle is sometimes sped along by what they call availability entrepreneurs, people who are making a buck on this stuff, individuals or organizations who are working with foundations or whatever to ensure continuous flow of news. The danger is increasingly exaggerated because the media are competing for headlines or clicks. And the scientists who try to dampen this attract a little attention, most of it hostile, and stating that they're suspected as a part of the cover-up. And in fact, this goes with the cognitive dissonance theory, that if an individual is saying, wait a minute, let's study the science and all that, so, well, you're part of the cover-up. This happens to me all the time. My affiliation with the leagues was long ago, and it ended because I started questioning the science and all that. But nonetheless, I'm saying, well, I believe this because I'm part of that. I'm paid by the league, which I'm not paid by the league. But individuals, the issue of conflict of interest is questioned in those that are dissonant, but oddly enough, not those that are considered the believers. The believers are getting salaries too. They're getting their names in papers too. They have a lot to gain, but it's a one-sided view that the deniers are the ones that are being paid off. So, when it comes down to current controversies, we got things like climate science, anti-vax movement, and I'm saying that we got to include CTE and contact sports in the same kind of thing. That there's this mentality that you either get a concussion and you have symptoms for life, or that if you don't believe that you're a denier, and other things. So, some of the things to try to study this in terms of, illusory truth or fake news kind of approaches. I'm not going to get into the details. I think you guys are familiar with the concepts, but the issues are, what do you do about it? So, one of the things that when people read these posts and other things, that there are a tendency for us to have a confirmation bias. People selectively expose themselves to the belief confirming information. They interpret information that's already in front of them in a confirming manner, and they selectively remember what confirms their biases. So how do we reverse the trend? That warnings at the time of the initial exposure, repeating the retractions and corrections that tell an alternative story. And I think that's what we need in this, at least as an alternative story on why we need to study this more and have some more other things about it. So what do we do as psychologists? I think we got to continue to study these conditions and other things, deflect attention away from football and hockey to investigate other populations, whether this exists, that continue with a practice that we're evidence-based, and commit ourselves to providing the public with a balanced view. So there in 1905, there was a call to ban football. A bunch of high school and college players died playing football that year. The NCAA was formed in a way to create the rules. So football has gone through these times before and has made it through. And I predict it will again, but it's we got a lot to do to help that along. So the question becomes, can we come with consensus? So there has been some consensus diagnosis that have been offered out there. My recommendation is that as a field, we should take these criteria, although they're not perfect. A lot of hard work and a lot of smart people contributed to them. And I suggest we use them and try to come to a consensus of how we're going to study this, and then go do the work. Do the work in doing the studies that need to be done, and see what we can get. So I'll leave that question if, yep, we'll go from there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barr. That was really thorough. I know I'm going to have to watch this over again, so I really appreciate you being here and having it recorded. We got tons of questions, so let me start with one that I think is more clinically pressing. Do you have any advice on talking with patients who come to the clinic and are worried that they have CTE?
Yeah, so, I think, going back to the criteria that are out there for research is pointing out that with these criteria, you need pretty big exposure. And so, I urge everybody to take a look at the neurology paper and the new criteria, but you need to have like 5 or more years of exposure to things like football. And you go into a different category if you have 11 or more years of exposure as professional football players. Okay, so that's different from a person who, like me, played high school football, had a couple concussions, but that was long ago. And the point is that that is far different than what these NFL players are going through. It's controversial enough with them, but when you think about the much less exposure, that there's really very little evidence. And so, I try to, tell our folks that they did not come close to having the exposure we're seeing in these cases that we're studying.
Gotcha. Thank you. I think that's really helpful. The next question has to do with players who are as young as 18 showing signs of tau pathology, obviously deceased players in some of the pathology reports.
Yep. So, I'm not a neuropathologist in that, but it's clear that those have been shown. But it's known that tau does exist in younger people, and I don't have any knowledge of more severe tau at that age. And what are the criteria that have been adopted in the NINDS criteria? It's mostly for stages 3 and 4. So my understanding is that the younger folks, when they show it, is more of the stage 1 or 2, which really hasn't been accepted or been established as clear CTE diagnosis. So I honestly don't know what's going on there. It's clearly something to look at and understand. It's troubling, the fact that those findings are there, but does that mean the same thing? That's still a question.
Definitely. Related to pathology, the next question asks, if both CTE and Alzheimer's are post-mortem diagnoses, do the pathology reports differentiate them?
That's an area that needs to be done in the research. That so far, there's been a lot of overlap. Even the clear CTE cases that have been identified in these studies have a lot of Alzheimer's pathology. And I really think that is one of the key studies that has to be done, because that goes back to the hypothesis by Randolph and other neuropsychologists that these football players, yeah, they're getting stuff, but it's Alzheimer's they're getting. And we still need, so that's, in my mind, that's the null hypothesis, that that football players get old and get Alzheimer's at a rate similar to what other people get. That null hypothesis has not been overturned in my mind.
That's a good point. The next question has to do with any comments you might have on second impact syndrome, and if there's a relationship between that and possibly CTE, and just your thoughts.
Yeah, the second impact syndrome is generally considered at the opposite end of the spectrum, meaning that it's only been reported in younger players, and the issue of whether it's a real thing has been questioned, meaning that in some of the cases there wasn't a well-defined first impact or things like that. So some people believe that it might be that some players unfortunately just have a predisposition, whether it be genetic or whatever, that to have brain swelling and herniation in response to a concussion occurred during competition. And we certainly as a field have to be able to find who those people are ahead of time. But in the meantime, whether it's really second impact syndrome and all that, it's unclear. And it seems to be a totally different kind of a neurobiologic process that we see in CTE.
Awesome, thank you. Last question, or maybe we'll have time for one more. So this person says, despite the controversy surrounding the existence of CTE, is it still agreed that the effects of concussion and repeated concussion can cause lasting impairments? Or are these hypotheses to explain why, or are there hypotheses to explain why symptoms may persist for some individuals?
I think there's still empirical questions. I think the overwhelming evidence is that a single uncomplicated concussion is short-lived. It's a short-lived neurophysiologic process. But there are some who believe that there might be some longer-term pathologic changes that we might be able to see down the road, but it doesn't exist at this point. The issue of multiple concussions, that raises the ante a little bit. We have good evidence that that's a whole different syndrome, having multiple concussions. And then the last one is the repetitive brain injury. That is a whole different thing altogether. So I think all of this stuff is on the table for evaluation, but the existing data that we have are that single uncomplicated concussions do not lead to lasting neuropath changes.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I think those are all the questions that we really have time for. Some of these are a little bit more in depth, so maybe we'll have to have you back for a follow-up.
To do that, whatever, yeah.
Wonderful. So thank you all for joining us today. Be on the lookout in your emails for upcoming series. Our mini series, No Neuroanatomy, is coming up in July, as well as Volume 4 in September. So we look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you so much, Dr. Barr.